What if I told you that one of the best-loved cars in British motoring history was, by almost every objective measure, already obsolete the day it left the factory floor? Picture Britain in 1953. The country was still pulling itself out of post-war austerity. Petrol rationing had only just ended the previous year. The Festival of Britain 2 years earlier had given people a glimpse of a modern future, but for most working families, that future was still a long way off. What they needed, desperately, was something affordable, something that started on a cold Monday morning, and something they could maintain themselves in the back garden with a basic set of tools. Into that world stepped the Ford Anglia 100E. Built at Ford's Dagenham plant and priced at around £511, including purchase tax, the 100E was neither the fastest nor the most sophisticated car on British roads. Compared to the Morris Minor already a year into using a more modern overhead valve engine, the Anglia looked like a refugee from the 1930s under the bonnet, and in many ways, it was. Yet between 1953 and 1959, Ford sold more than 350,000 of them. Doctors, teachers, salesmen, and farmers bought them. Families crammed into them for seaside holidays. Young men in their 20s learned to drive in them. The 100E became part of the fabric of ordinary British life in a way that no amount of engineering elegance could guarantee. So how do we explain that? How does a car with a pre-war engine, vacuum-powered windscreen wipers, and a gearbox that wore out before it reached 40,000 miles become a symbol of an era? The answer tells us something honest about what motoring meant in post-war Britain and about the peculiar British talent for making do with what you had and loving it all the same. Here are the 7 genuine, verified problems with the Ford Anglia 100E, and the paradox that explains why, for 350,000 British families, it simply didn't matter. Problem 1. The engine that time had already left behind. Let's start with the most fundamental issue of all, the engine itself. The Ford Anglia 100E was powered by a side valve unit of 1,172 cubic centimeters, producing 36 brake horsepower. That figure alone doesn't tell the full story. The real problem is where that engine came from. Side valve engines, where the valves sit beside the pistons in the block rather than above them in the cylinder head, were an engineering arrangement that most manufacturers had moved away from in the late 1940s. By 1953, the technology was genuinely pre-war in its origins. Ford had used variants of this engine family since the early 1930s, and while it had been progressively refined through those 2 decades, it hadn't been fundamentally rethought. Meanwhile, the competition had modernized. The Morris Minor had switched to an overhead valve engine in 1952. The Austin A30 launched with an overhead valve unit from the outset. Even the Standard 8 used overhead valves. The Anglia 100E arrived at a moment when every serious rival had already moved to more efficient, more powerful engine architecture, and the Anglia was still using a layout that dated back to before the war. Why didn't Ford update it? The honest answer is economics. The side valve tooling was paid for. The engine was proven, simple to manufacture, and accessible enough that ordinary mechanics could work on it without specialist training. In the cold logic of post-war Dagenham, that counted for a great deal. The consequences were felt at the roadside. 0 to 97 kilometers per hour took 29.4 seconds, a figure that demanded patience from any driver attempting to join a fast road or overtake a laden lorry on a country lane. Top speed was in the region of 115 kilometers per hour under ideal conditions, but sustaining it required the engine to have been well maintained and the weather to be cooperating. And yet here is the paradox that runs through this entire story. That same simple engine was one of the primary reasons British buyers trusted the car. It was accessible. You could see what you were dealing with. A decent, local garage could rebuild it without specialist equipment. A competent owner could do a great deal of the work himself. For a country that had spent a decade making do, that accessibility wasn't a flaw. It was, in a very genuine sense, a virtue. Problem 2. The fuel pump that cooked in its own heat. If the engine was the 100E's original sin, the fuel system was its most infuriating daily companion. The mechanical fuel pump on the 100E was positioned in a way that created a persistent engineering problem. It sat in close proximity to the exhaust manifold. Under normal operating conditions, with the car moving and air flowing through the engine bay, this wasn't a disaster. But leave the car standing on a warm summer afternoon, or let it idle in slow traffic for any length of time, and the heat radiating from the exhaust could cause the petrol in the pump to vaporize before it reached the carburetor. The result was hot starting failure. The engine would turn over perfectly, sometimes fire for a second or two, and then die. The fuel wasn't getting through. It had turned to vapor inside the pump body. Experienced 100E owners learned to recognize the condition immediately. Many carried a small bottle of water specifically to cool the pump down in emergencies, pouring it over the unit, waiting a minute, and then attempting to start the engine again. Others fitted a heat shield between the pump and the exhaust system, which reduced the frequency of the problem significantly. From 1956 onwards, Ford modified the fuel pump design, and fitting the later version to an earlier car was a recognized and worthwhile improvement. When the heat shield and the revised pump still weren't enough, an electric fuel pump offered the most reliable long-term solution. The frustrating thing was that none of this was difficult to solve once you knew what you were dealing with. But for an uninitiated owner who hadn't been warned, standing at the roadside in August with an Anglia that refused to start could be a genuinely baffling experience. The paradox here is clear. A more sophisticated fuel delivery system would have avoided these problems entirely, but it would also have been far beyond most home mechanics to diagnose or repair. The vapor lock, at least, could be fixed with a jug of cold water and a few minutes of patience. In the vocabulary of 1950s British motoring, that was practically a feature. Problem 3. A gearbox with a predictable lifespan. The 3-speed gearbox fitted to the Ford Anglia 100E was another component that worked adequately when new and wore in a highly recognizable pattern as the miles accumulated. The typical lifespan of a standard 100E gearbox, under normal use, was in the region of 40,000 miles before the first serious symptoms appeared. The most consistent warning sign was a tendency to jump out of second gear, usually under load, when accelerating through a bend or pulling away on an incline. Once the car began doing this, a rebuild was not far away. The unit also suffered from what many owners described as resonance, a low-frequency vibration that transmitted through the gear lever at certain speeds, typically in the cruising range around 80 to 90 kilometers per hour. It wasn't dangerous, but it was persistent and noticeable, particularly on a long motorway journey. One practical lesson that experienced 100E owners absorbed early was the importance of regular oil changes in both the gearbox and the rear axle. Attending to this every 8,000 kilometers made a measurable difference to the longevity of both units. Neglect it, and the wear accelerated noticeably. The 3-speed arrangement itself was another reflection of the 100E's period origins. Most serious European competitors were offering 4-speed boxes by the mid-1950s, giving drivers more flexibility on faster roads. The 3-speed box was adequate for British roads of the early 1950s. But as motor transport grew faster and more demanding through the decade, its limitations became increasingly apparent. And yet British drivers managed. They learned the gearbox's character, anticipated the wear, serviced accordingly, and rebuilt when necessary. It was predictable, which, in the vocabulary of practical British motoring, counted as a form of reliability. You knew what was coming, and you planned for it. Problem 4. The differential that needed a specialist. Of all the mechanical challenges presented by the Ford Anglia 100E, the rear differential stands out as the component most likely to defeat even a competent and experienced home mechanic. The differential required such a specific range of special tools to set up correctly that attempting a home rebuild was, for most private owners, simply not practical. The problem wasn't lack of skill, it was the precision required to correctly set the bearing preload and the gear mesh pattern. work that demanded measuring equipment and proprietary tools that few private garages possessed. This was a significant departure from the 100E's general character as a friendly car for the home mechanic. Almost everything else on the car could be tackled with a reasonable toolkit and a workshop manual. The differential was the exception, and an expensive one. The practical solution that experienced owners and club members developed over time was to source and install the differential from the Ford 107E, the Prefect, produced alongside the 100E from 1955. The 107E differential was mechanically compatible with the 100E's rear axle, and, crucially, was considerably more straightforward to work on at home. Knowledge of this substitution circulated through the ownership community and through Ford clubs as reliable, proven guidance. It is worth saying plainly, if your 100E's differential failed and you took the car to a general garage without specific experience of these models, you might well have been quoted a price that felt disproportionate to the car's overall value. The informed owner, armed with the 107E solution and a contact at the local Ford club, was in a considerably better position. That disparity between what the knowledgeable enthusiast could manage and what an uninitiated owner would struggle with was characteristic of much British motoring in this era. Problem 5. Rust where it matters most. The Ford Anglia 100E's bodywork was built from relatively thick sheet metal by the standards of the period, and this is genuinely good news for survivors today. Terminal rust through the main body panels is uncommon compared to many cars of the same age. But that general robustness should not lead a prospective buyer or restorer into complacency, because there is one specific area where rust attacks with particular determination, and it happens to be structurally critical. The top of each McPherson strut mounting is the place to examine first on any 100E. This is precisely where water collects, where it sits, and where corrosion establishes itself most readily. The mounting itself is load-bearing. It carries the force of the front suspension directly into the body structure, so any deterioration here is emphatically not a cosmetic matter. Any repairs to this area must be properly welded at the seam. Filling alone is not acceptable, and any evidence of previous repair work should be examined carefully to establish how thoroughly it was executed. There is a further complication that makes this area even more significant. The chassis number on the Ford Anglia 100E is stamped directly on top of the right-hand strut mounting. This is precisely the area most vulnerable to corrosion and the one most frequently subject to repair work. Finding a fully legible, undisturbed chassis number on an unrestored 100E is rather less straightforward than it might appear, and on a car that has been through any bodywork restoration, the stamp may be partially or wholly obscured. For anyone inspecting a 100E today, whether for purchase, restoration, or insurance valuation, the strut tower area warrants the inspection torch and a sharp, patient eye before anything else. The thick steel elsewhere in the body is a genuine and lasting advantage, but it cannot be assumed to extend to the area where the car is most vulnerable. Problem 6. Wipers that failed when you needed them most. The vacuum-operated windscreen wipers fitted to the Ford Anglia 100E occupy a special place in the catalogue of British motoring inconvenience. They were, by any practical measure, inadequate, and they failed in a manner that was almost perfectly calibrated to cause the most frustration at the worst possible moment. The wipers on the 100E were driven by engine vacuum, which meant that their speed was directly linked to the load being placed on the engine. At low engine speeds idling through town, waiting at a junction, or rolling along a quiet lane, the vacuum was adequate, and the wipers moved at something approaching a useful pace. The moment the driver put their foot down to accelerate precisely when visibility in heavy rain was most critical, the engine vacuum dropped sharply, and the wipers slowed to near immobility. In effect, the harder you drove the car in wet conditions, the less the wipers contributed to your visibility. This was not a fault that developed with age or wear. It was an inherent characteristic of the vacuum system from the day the car was built. Ford was not alone in fitting vacuum wipers to its smaller cars. During this period, the technology was common across the British industry, but the 100E's system had a particularly poor reputation, even by the tolerant. standards of the time. It was one of the criticisms that appeared most consistently in period road tests and in owner correspondence published in motoring magazines through the 1950s. When Ford introduced the 105E Anglia in 1959 to replace the 100E, the switch to conventional electric wipers was among the changes most widely noted and welcomed in the motoring press. It had taken 6 years to address what was, for any driver who had experienced a British autumn in the car, an obvious and daily limitation. The British owner, as ever, found a way to manage by driving with more caution, by carrying on, and by muttering about it quietly. Problem 7. A modest machine in an increasingly impatient world. The final problem with the Ford Anglia 100E is not a mechanical fault in the traditional sense. It is more of a fundamental mismatch between the car's design parameters and the world it was increasingly asked to operate in. The 100E was conceived for the British roads of the early 1950s, roads that were neither fast nor particularly demanding, and a motoring environment where the sheer act of reliable private transport was still, for many families, a novelty rather than a given. Its 36 brake horsepower and 29.4-second sprint to 97 kilometers per hour were, if not impressive, even by the standards of 1953, at least adequate for the pace of traffic that prevailed at the time. As the decade progressed, that adequacy eroded, the roads improved, traffic moved faster. British motorway construction began in 1958 with the Preston Bypass and the first sections of the M1 in 1959. The modest performance margins that the 100E had squeaked by on in urban driving became genuinely problematic when sustained higher speeds were required. Beyond the straight-line performance, the car's narrow body and suspension geometry could make it feel unsettled on roads with uneven surfaces, not dangerous in the hands of a patient and experienced driver, but demanding of constant attention at speeds above its natural comfort zone. The tendency to roll in corners was noticeable and required deliberate weight management from the driver rather than passive confidence from the chassis. In completely standard form, keeping pace with the flow of modern traffic outside town required genuine effort and careful forward planning rather than any reserve of available power. This is simply the reality of a car built around a pre-war engine producing 36 brake horsepower, and there is no point in dressing it up otherwise for an audience that knows exactly what these cars felt like at speed. And yet, every Ford rally, every classic car weekend, every winding country lane in summer still sees the 100E out and about. It was never fast. It never pretended to be. That was never quite the point of it, and the people who love it today understand that completely. So here we have it, 7 genuine, verifiable problems with a car that sold more than 350,000 examples in 6 years. And that remains an object of real and lasting affection more than 60 years after the last one left the Dagenham production line. The side valve engine that was already a generation behind the competition, the fuel pump that boiled in summer heat, the gearbox with a predictable 40,000-mile lifespan, the differential that defeated even competent home mechanics, the rust that lurked precisely where the chassis number was stamped, the wipers that slowed the moment you needed them to work, the performance that asked for patience rather than rewarding enthusiasm. None of these things are invented, and none of them are minor. For a motoring journalist writing in 1953, any one of them would have constituted a legitimate criticism. Taken together, they paint a clear picture of a car that was, in strictly technical terms, behind its best competitors from the moment it first appeared in the showroom. And yet, the Ford Anglia 100E was loved not simply despite these characteristics, but in a very British way, partly because of them. It was familiar. It was accessible. A man who understood engines could keep it running with modest tools, modest parts, and a reasonable investment of Saturday afternoons. It didn't ask for anything exotic or expensive. It started, mostly. It got you there, mostly, and when it didn't, you knew why, and you knew how to fix it. There is something genuinely honest about a car like the 100E. It asked you to understand it, and if you did, it rewarded that understanding with straightforward, predictable behavior and a long and serviceable life. For the Britain of the 1950s, still cautious, still careful, still accustomed to making the very best of what was available, that was enough, more than enough. If you drove one of these, owned one, or simply grew up watching one parked outside a neighbor's house on a Sunday morning, I would genuinely love to read about it in the comments below. Every one of these cars has a story, and the people who know them best are, without question, the people watching this channel right now. If you found this worthwhile, a like and a subscription mean considerably more than you might think. They help this channel reach the people who care about exactly this kind of history. Thank you for watching. And thank you for knowing these cars the way that only a few people still do.